Morning fog floated over Hartwell, settling on untouched snow as if the whole town held its breath. On the hill, the old stone house waited, weathered, silent, its front door slightly open, guarding secrets of its own. Up the winding path came a man and his German shepherd. Daniel walked with the tired weight of a soldier shaped by war. Ranger stayed close, alert to every shift in the cold air. Halfway up the slope, Ranger stopped dead, ears up, body locked. Something unseen stirred, and one question cut through Daniel's chest like the winter wind. Why would a dying aunt leave everything to a nephew she hadn't seen in decades? And what truth inside this house was she protecting until her last breath? Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country below and hit subscribe. Winter pressed quietly against the edges of the world, laying a pale hush across the forest. A faint haze drifted through the bare pines, as if the cold itself were exhaling. Snow clung to branches in delicate layers, untouched, undisturbed, and the morning light, thin and blue, hung low like a sigh waiting to fall. It was the kind of quiet that made a person wonder what news the day intended to bring. Inside the small cabin tucked deep between the trees, Daniel sat at the wooden table, shoulders slightly hunched, hands wrapped around a cup of cooling coffee. At 46, he still carried the undeniable presence of a strong, handsome man, hazel hair cut short, threads of silver marking his temples, a thin, neat beard touched with the same softened gray. But his eyes gave him away. They carried an exhaustion shaped not by age, but by memory. There was a guardedness there, as if he feared that letting his gaze drift too far inward might bring something back he wasn't ready to face. PTSD had carved invisible borders around his life, shaping not just how he thought, but where he could exist. Crowds were overwhelming, too many faces, too many voices layered on top of each other. Loud sounds dragged old battlefields into the present. Even simple tasks became unpredictable traps. Out here, in his cabin, the world moved slowly enough for his mind to keep pace. The solitude wasn't a preference, it was survival. At his feet lay Ranger, the German shepherd who had become more lifeline than companion. The dog's sable coat rose and fell in steady rhythm, though his amber eyes remained half open, always attentive. Ranger was strong, broad-chested, with an alert posture even in rest. He seemed to understand every shift in Daniel's breathing, every tremor beneath the surface. If Daniel had lost the ability to trust himself, Ranger had taken on the responsibility of trusting for them both. The sound of an engine rolling slowly up the dirt road sliced through the stillness like a foreign object. Ranger's ears lifted instantly. Daniel's pulse quickened, fast, sharp, instinctive. Noise, surprise, footsteps, each could pull him toward that old familiar edge. He inhaled deliberately, grounding himself, repeating a silent sequence he'd practiced over the years. Slow breath in, hold, slow exhale. A truck stopped outside. Daniel stood, setting the cup aside. Ranger moved with him, not protectively, but purposefully, positioning himself slightly forward, eyes narrowed. Through the frosted window, Daniel saw a man step out, wrapped in a thick winter coat, scarf pulled tight. His movements were slow and deliberate, and as he approached, Daniel saw kindness etched into his features, rounded cheeks flushed with cold, soft blue eyes, and thinning blonde hair combed carefully back. The man stopped on the porch, clearing his throat. "Mr. Dalton?" he asked gently. "That's me," Daniel replied quietly. "My name is Hargreaves," the man continued. "I'm an attorney from Hartwell. I'm here with something important." Daniel didn't invite him inside. That space were rarely open to strangers, but he stepped outside, allowing the cold air to settle between them. Ranger stayed close, breath fogging the air. Hargreaves reached inside his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. The handwriting across the front was unmistakable, elegant even in its age. Louisa Hartwell. Daniel's breath left him in a silent collapse, a small tremor through his chest. He hadn't seen her in years, not because he'd stopped caring, but because life had a way of swallowing people whole. Louisa hadn't wanted to burden him when he enlisted, and after he returned from the war, fragmented and shaking, Daniel had convinced himself she deserved better than the broken version of him. They loved each other deeply, but from far, each believing distance was its own form of protection. He took the letter with both hands, thumb brushing lightly across her name. It was like touching a memory. Breaking the seal felt like breaking something fragile. The first line hit him harder than any explosion he had ever survived. "We regret to inform you that Mrs. Louisa Hartwell passed away peacefully." The world blurred. Daniel lowered himself onto the porch step, not trusting his legs. The cold wood pressed into him, but he barely felt it. Ranger nudged against him, pushing his head under Daniel's hand, as if reminding him he wasn't alone. Not this time, not for this. Hargreaves looked away respectfully. Grief came quietly for Daniel, not loud, not wild. It seeped in like cold water, filling the hollow spaces. Louisa wasn't just an aunt. She was his last tether to the life he'd had before he changed, before war shook loose the pieces that no longer fit. She was memory made human. And now, she was gone. He continued reading, hands trembling. Louisa had left him her old stone house on Hartwell Hill, the place she grew up, the place he had once spent childhood summers running across sunlit floors and up creaking staircases. He could still remember her teaching him how to tie his boots for the first time, her warm hands guiding his clumsy fingers, smiling with patient pride. At the end of the letter, written in her own uneven handwriting, was a final note. "Come home, Daniel. There is something here you need." The words tightened his throat. Louisa had always spoken in ways that reached beyond the surface, as if she saw the fractures in him long before anyone else did. He folded the letter slowly, almost reverently. "I'm very sorry," Hargreaves said softly. "She cared for you deeply, spoke of you often." Daniel nodded, unable to find his voice. When the attorney finally drove away, the forest fell into stillness again. But it wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt hollow. Inside the cabin, Daniel placed the letter on the table and stared at it, hands braced. Against the wood. Ranger circled once, then pressed close, leaning his weight against Daniel's leg. The simple warmth of the dog anchored him. "I should have gone back," Daniel whispered, voice cracking. Ranger tilted his head as if disagreeing. Guilt swirled heavy, years of distance, of silence. But beneath it, something unexpected flickered, the faintest pull of hope. Louisa had asked him to come home. She had left those words for him and no one else. He looked again at the letter. "There is something here you need." What could she have meant? Why now? Why call him back only in death? Questions rose, but one truth remained solid. He had to go. Ranger nudged the edge of a worn leather bag beneath the table, scraping it forward just an inch. Daniel huffed out a broken laugh. "You always know, don't you?" He pulled the bag out and began packing. Each piece of clothing folded into place felt like turning a page he'd been too afraid to read. The cabin had been his refuge, but refuge is not the same thing as healing. By the time he closed the door, the air outside had grown colder, sharper. Ranger leapt into the truck with disciplined grace. Daniel stood for a moment on the porch, letting the wind brush against his face as though clearing a path through his grief. "Louisa," he murmured, "I'm coming home." He turned the key. The engine rumbled through the quiet woods, breaking the stillness he had lived in for years. Grief pushed him forward. Love, buried but unbroken, guided him. And the road ahead, stretching like a pale ribbon into the winter morning, carried him back toward a past he had feared and longed for in equal measure. The road into Hartwell wound through gentle hills, each curve revealing a town that moved in the quiet rhythm of people who had learned to live with the seasons rather than against them. The morning air carried a faint scent of wood smoke, and the rooftops, pewter gray under winter light, looked like they had grown from the land itself. Daniel drove with the window cracked open enough to let the cold steady him. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears flicking at every shift in sound, as if cataloging the new world unfolding around them. Hartwell was small, neat rows of old brick, a few faded shops, a diner that looked unchanged since the early 70s. People moved slowly here, their faces carrying that particular softness found in rural towns. When Daniel parked near the courthouse square, a few heads turned, not out of suspicion, but mild curiosity. He didn't blend easily. Tall, weathered, worn canvas coat, brushing against his beige shirt. Dark charcoal chinos, boots scuffed by years of rough ground. And Ranger, big and steady at his side, was hard to miss. A woman selling baked goods at a small stand was the first to approach. She was in her 60s, short and round-faced, with curly gray hair tucked beneath a knitted hat. Her name, stitched on the apron, read Marla. Her voice held the warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime mothering the entire town. "You must be Louisa's boy," she said with a soft smile. Her brown eyes shone with a sympathy that reached him even before she spoke again. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Daniel nodded, swallowing the tightness in his throat. "Thank you." Marla's gaze drifted to Ranger. "And who's this handsome fella?" "Ranger," Daniel said. She chuckled. "A good name for a good dog. Louisa liked German shepherds, said they had truthful eyes." Daniel felt the faintest ache in his chest. Even strangers here spoke of Louisa with affection so natural it felt like she were still alive. He walked up the narrow hill toward her property. Hartwell's streets were lined with bare maples, their branches swaying softly. Ranger stayed close but alert, tail low, nose testing the air. The closer they came to the stone house, the more Daniel felt the weight of memory pressing softly at the edges of his thoughts. The house waited at the end of a gravel path, 2 stories of old stone, faded by wind and time. Ivy clung to the outer wall, brittle under winter. The porch sagged slightly, but the structure still carried the dignity of something built to outlast generations. A single window reflected the pale sky like an unmoving eye. As Daniel stepped onto the porch, Ranger stiffened for a moment before relaxing. Not danger, just unfamiliarity. The door opened before Daniel could knock. A young woman stood there, clutching a basket of folded linens. She froze when she saw him. Then her expression softened into recognition he didn't understand. She looked to be in her mid-20s, tall and slender, with a gentle posture that made her presence feel like a quiet reassurance. Her hair was dark auburn, pulled loosely into a braid over one shoulder. Her skin was fair, lightly freckled across the nose, and her eyes, hazel but warmer than his, held a softness that felt oddly familiar. "You're Daniel," she said, not asking but knowing. He blinked. "Yes, I'm Emma." Her voice was soft but steady, the tone of someone accustomed to calming fearful people, tending the sick, listening more than she spoke. She stepped aside. "Come in, please." The interior smelled faintly of lavender and old books, 2 scents Daniel had always associated with Louisa. The living room held furniture worn but cared for, lace curtains, framed photos. A woven rug faded at the center. Ranger sniffed the floorboards, tail giving a slow, respectful sway. Emma set the basket down on a table. smoothing a hand over the linen as if grounding herself. "I was helping keep the house in order," she said. "Louisa asked me to. She wanted everything ready for when you came." Daniel looked around, throat tightening again. Louisa's handwriting, her voice, her memories were everywhere. "She talked about you every day," Emma continued. "She told me stories about you that made me feel like I already knew the shape of your heart." Daniel looked at her sharply, surprised. Emma did not look away. Her gaze was not romantic nor intrusive, simply honest, the kind of honesty that made avoidance impossible. "She told me you never left a friend behind," Emma murmured, "that you carried the spirit of your father, and that, even when life hurt you, you still tried to live gently." Daniel swallowed. He did not see himself that way, but Louisa had always seen what he couldn't. "She was proud of you, Daniel. So proud." Her voice softened at the final words, and something inside him cracked slightly, like ice giving way to water beneath. He looked toward the mantelpiece where a framed photograph rested, a picture of Louisa smiling, her hair pinned up the way she used to, eyes bright with the same kindness he remembered from childhood. Daniel reached out and touched the edge of the frame, fingertips trembling. Ranger sat beside him, leaning his head gently against Daniel's leg. "She didn't deserve to go alone," Daniel whispered. Emma stepped closer, but not too close. She understood boundaries instinctively. "She wasn't alone," she said softly. "I was with her, and she spoke your name until the very end." Daniel closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. For a moment, silence settled around them again. Warm, fragile, heavy with the kind of grief shared between two people connected by the memory of the same woman. Ranger's sudden movement broke it. His ears snapped forward, body tensing. He moved toward the front door, nose close to the floorboards. A low rumble vibrated in. His chest, alert, not aggressive. "What is it, boy?" Daniel murmured. Emma frowned slightly. "What's wrong?" Daniel crouched beside Ranger, studying the area around the base of the door. Faded winter dirt marked the threshold, but there, amid the settled dust, was a fresh disturbance. A partial print. Not recent enough to be a threat now, but recent enough to matter. A footprint. One that wasn't his, or Emma's. Someone had been here. Ranger pressed his nose to the print, breath sharp and focused. Daniel's body tightened instinctively, the old training flickering awake, not panic, but readiness. "Has anyone else been in the house?" he asked quietly. Emma shook her head. "No, only me, and the lawyers for the will." She hesitated, brow knitting. "Why?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked again at the floor, then at the doorway, then toward the quiet road where the winter wind carried flakes of snow across the gravel. Hartwell felt peaceful, but peace could hide things, people, motives, secrets. Ranger sat beside him, ears alert, body angled toward the door as if waiting for a command. Daniel's voice was steady when he finally spoke. "Because somebody else came here," he said softly, "and they didn't want to be noticed." The wind outside shifted as evening crept over Hartwell, threading a low whistle through the stone edges of the house. Shadows stretched across the living room, softening the worn floorboards and turning the corners dim. Daniel stood near the old bookshelf, his hand still resting on the frame of Louisa's photograph, while Ranger paced silently at his feet, sniffing the floor with renewed urgency. Emma watched from a respectful distance, her hands loosely folded in front of her, brow creased with quiet concern. Ranger paused abruptly, his tail stiffening. He lowered his head and pressed his nose against the edge of a faded rug near the center of the room. Daniel stepped toward him, his pulse tightening. "What's he found?" Emma asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel knelt beside Ranger, gripping the rug's corner. The fabric was old, woven with a pattern that had long since lost its color, but the weight of it still felt strangely deliberate, as though someone had placed it there with intention. He hesitated for a breath, then lifted. A metallic glint sliced through the dimness. A square steel hatch lay embedded in the floor, its surface dulled by age, a small latch tucked tight against its frame. It was the kind of door that didn't belong in a modest home, heavy, industrial, purposeful. Emma's breath caught. "I didn't know this was here." "Neither did I," Daniel murmured, though something in him whispered otherwise, an echo from a childhood memory he hadn't realized he still carried. He remembered being told never to play under the rug. He had thought Louisa simply feared he might trip. Now, the truth pressed cold against his ribs. Ranger nudged the hatch, then looked up at Daniel, amber eyes bright with instinctive insistence. Daniel opened the latch. A draft of cold air rose from below, smelling faintly of dust, old metal, and something else, something preserved in the stillness of decades. He lifted the hatch. A dark staircase led downward. The basement had always been off limits. As a child, Daniel had once asked what was beneath the house, and Louisa had only said, "Nothing you need to see yet." The word "yet" echoed now in his mind, hollow and heavy. Emma stepped closer, her braid brushing lightly against her shoulder as she leaned over the opening. "Should we go down there?" Daniel swallowed, forcing down the wave of unease that threatened to rise. "I need to." He glanced at her. "You don't have to come." But Emma shook her head, eyes steady. "I told her I'd watch after the house. That means watching after what you find in it." He couldn't argue with that, not when her voice carried the same gentle resolve Louisa once had. Daniel descended first, Ranger close behind, paws clicking softly on the wooden steps. Emma followed carefully, her steps light, one hand tracing the wall for balance. The deeper they went, the colder it grew. A single hanging bulb flickered weakly when Daniel tugged its chain, casting the room in a pale yellow haze. The basement stretched wide, far wider than the footprint of the house suggested. Thick steel beams reinforced the walls. Old crates lined the edges, covered in canvas sheets. A filing cabinet sat rusted in the far corner, beside a heavy iron door bolted shut from the inside. Emma exhaled slowly. "This is not a normal basement." "No," Daniel said quietly. "It isn't." Ranger circled the room once, nose working the air, before he stopped near a shelf where a leather-bound book lay half-hidden beneath a cloth. He barked a single sharp note. Daniel moved toward it. When he lifted the cloth, a tremor ran through him. It was Louisa's handwriting on the cover. Journal, LH. He touched the leather gently, a strange mixture of fear and longing twisting inside him. Emma stepped closer, standing beside him without speaking. He opened the journal. The first pages were dated nearly 70 years ago, handwritten entries in Louisa's careful cursive. The ink had faded in places, but her words carried their weight with unwavering clarity. Emma leaned slightly, eyes scanning the page. "She wrote a lot," she murmured. Daniel nodded. "She never talked much about her past." They read in silence. Louisa had been part of an emergency civilian operation during the late years of the war, Operation Hearthstone, a classified assignment responsible for safeguarding federal materials until the government could reclaim them. She and a handful of others had been sworn to secrecy, signing agreements that forbade them from surrendering the materials without official retrieval. But within months, the officer in charge died unexpectedly, and the bureaucratic trail vanished. Time eroded the operation's structure. New administrations arrived, old records vanished into storage, and the vault remained in Louisa's custody. One passage caught Daniel's breath. "They told us we would be contacted when it was time, but no one ever did, And after 30 years, I realized no one remembered. The vault was forgotten, and the burden became mine alone. Daniel's jaw tightened. Another entry bled deeper. If I come forward now, they might think I stole it. I am an old woman. They will not believe I was entrusted with it. And I cannot risk Daniel becoming tangled in something he does not deserve. He has already carried too much pain. Emma raised a hand to her mouth. She protected you. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, a sharp ache rising through him. She always did. He turned another page. I will not give it to anyone else. Only Daniel. Only when he is older, strong enough to see it for what it is and not be destroyed by the weight of it. The words trembled where her hand must have trembled writing them. Emma whispered, "She waited for you." Daniel forced himself to breathe. Ranger pressed against his side, sensing the shift in his heart. Another entry read, I know that when I am gone, he will grieve, and that grief will bring him home. Noi buon sedan no venia. Emma's eyes shone. She told me that once, she said softly. I thought she meant it as comfort. I didn't know she meant this. Daniel closed the journal, unable to read more for now. His mind spun, not in panic, but in the heavy understanding of everything Louisa had carried alone. The secrecy, the responsibility, the burden that stretched through decades, and all of it for him. Emma exhaled slowly. Daniel. This is why she didn't report it. She wasn't hiding anything. She was guarding it. And guarding me, he whispered. They moved deeper into the room. Daniel lifted a canvas sheet from a large metal crate and found another layer of reinforced steel beneath it. Unopened, untouched. The vault she had protected. But opening it was not part of today's story. Today was about truth, not treasure. Emma stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on Daniel's arm, not to hold him, but to steady the moment. She trusted you with this, not the government, not the town, you. Daniel nodded slowly. His throat felt raw. Ranger brushed against him, warm and grounding. He looked back at the journal in his hand. Louisa had carried this secret for a lifetime, and now it was his turn. Cold air clung to the basement as Daniel stood before the massive steel door embedded into the far wall. The dim bulb overhead flickered once, throwing shadows across the reinforced beams that crossed the ceiling. Ranger remained at Daniel's side, steady and alert, his amber eyes following each hesitant movement with quiet vigilance. Emma lingered a few steps back, arms wrapped gently around herself for warmth, her expression a blend of curiosity and fear. The vault seemed to breathe in the low light, a relic not of wealth, but of burden. Daniel brushed dust from the thick latch, his fingertips trembling. The steel felt impossibly cold, as though it had been carved from winter itself. He exhaled slowly. Opening it felt like touching the last remnant of Louisa's life. Part duty, part grief, part revelation. Are you ready? Emma asked softly. She stood with her braids slightly unraveled, loose strands framing her face. Her eyes, warm hazel with flecks of gold, held a depth of compassion that came from years of caring for the sick and dying. Emma's presence was gentle but sturdy, the sort of person who could face darkness without flinching because she had spent her life walking through other people's shadows. Daniel nodded. I need to know, he said. The words felt heavy, as if spoken from somewhere in the marrow of his bones. The vault groaned when he turned the wheel, metal grinding like a creature woken from a 70-year sleep. Ranger stepped forward, ears tight, body lowered in a cautious stance. The door released with a long shudder, and Daniel pulled it open. A cold draft swept out. Inside stood rows of military-grade crates stacked neatly, each stamped with the faded emblem of the U.S. Treasury. Dust coated every surface except a narrow path straight down the middle, as though Louisa had walked it many times in careful silence. Old filing cabinets lined the side walls, their labels handwritten, yellowed, and curling. Emma's breath trembled. "My God, this is real!" Daniel stepped inside. The sound of his boots echoed off the steel walls. Ranger followed, paws soundless on the concrete floor. One of the crates near the entrance caught Daniel's attention. He brushed his hand across the lid and felt the imprint of embossed letters beneath the dust. Specimen Hold, Federal Reserve. His throat tightened. Louisa's life had been entwined with something enormous, something secret enough to reshape what Daniel thought he knew about the woman who had tucked him into bed as a child. Emma stepped inside behind him. "She carried all of this alone," she whispered, voice catching on the enormity of it. "How heavy must that have been?" Daniel didn't answer. He was drawn toward an old wooden box tucked between the metal crates, something out of place among the cold rigidity of the vault. Ranger moved toward it first, sniffing the air, then sitting down with a short huff, as if declaring it important. Daniel lifted the box onto a nearby crate. The wood was worn smooth at the edges, the brass hinges tarnished. He opened it gently. Inside lay a stack of documents tied with cotton twine, a handkerchief neatly folded, and beneath them, a photograph. Daniel lifted the photograph carefully. It had been taken decades ago, but the faces were clear despite the faded edges. Louisa stood in the sunlight, younger, hair pinned in soft curls, eyes bright with a courage Daniel had only glimpsed in her final note. Beside her stood a man in uniform, tall and handsome, jaw strong, shoulders squared with quiet confidence. His hair was dark, his expression kind. He had one hand on Louisa's back, as though grounding her to the earth. Emma leaned closer, her breath soft. "Who is he?" Daniel turned the photo over. "If I cannot keep the man I love, I will keep the promise he died protecting." Emma covered her mouth with her hand, eyes flooding with emotion. "Her husband," Daniel nodded. "He died before I was born." She never talked about him much. Emma traced the edge of the photo without touching it. She loved him fiercely. You can see it. Daniel stared at his aunt's face, at the gentle tilt of her smile, at the way she leaned into the man as if he were the anchor that held her world steady. "I never realized how young she was," he said quietly. "How much she lost." Emma looked at him, her voice softening even more. "She didn't lose everything." She paused. "She had you." Daniel swallowed, setting the photograph down carefully. "She gave me more than I ever understood." He untied the stack of documents in the box. Inside were letters typed on government stationery, stamped with seals he recognized from his time in the service. Forms, inventory lists, a faded map, and at the bottom, Louisa's handwritten notes. Emma stepped closer, her shoulder brushing his arm gently. "She wrote these?" "Yes," Daniel murmured. "These are her logs." Louisa documented her daily checks on the vault, her fear that the government had forgotten Operation Hearthstone, and her worry that speaking up would bring trouble to Daniel. There was no bitterness in her words, only duty, love, and the heavy weight of responsibility. One note struck Daniel sharply. If Daniel ever comes for this, let him come as a man who knows loss but is not broken by it. He will have a loyal heart, that much I believe. Emma's voice trembled. "She believed in you." Daniel looked around the vault, hundreds of crates, countless secrets, a lifetime of fear and loyalty etched into steel. And through it all, Louisa had waited for him. Ranger brushed his head against Daniel's knee, grounding him. Daniel placed a steady hand on the dog's back. Emma had been quietly studying him, reading the shifting emotions on his face with that uncanny sensitivity she possessed. "She left all of this to you," she said, voice gentle. Not because you were her nephew, but because you have his spirit. She tapped the photo lightly. Her husband, the man who believed in promises, in duty, in doing what's right even when it costs something. Daniel's chest tightened. The weight of his aunt's trust settled over him like an invisible cloak, both heavy and strengthening. He lifted the photograph one more time. Louisa's smile seemed to hold all the warmth he had been chasing his entire life. I didn't know she saw me that way, he whispered. Emma's answer was quiet but firm. She always did. Daniel looked around the vault again. This was not treasure. It was a vow frozen in time, carried by a woman who had loved with unwavering clarity. He understood now why she had never surrendered it, and why she had waited for him. He closed the box gently. This wasn't wealth, he said softly. It was her burden, her legacy. And now, it's mine. Emma nodded slowly, eyes steady on him. Ranger stood beside Daniel, tail still, body strong, as if sensing the shift in responsibility. In the cold, quiet vault beneath the stone house, Daniel felt something settle inside him. Not fear, not grief, but purpose. A direction shaped by loyalty, by loss, by love, passed through generations. Louisa had kept a promise she didn't have to keep. Now it was his turn. Night pressed against the stone house like a quiet tide, dimming the world to nothing more than a faint glow from the porch lantern. Daniel stood at the kitchen sink, washing the dust of the vault from his hands while Ranger slept near the door, curled into a protective half-circle. Emma had gone home an hour earlier after helping him cover the vault entrance with the rug again, though her lingering worry had followed her out into the cold. Daniel had assured her he'd be fine, but even he could feel something unsettled in the air, something that tugged at Ranger's instincts and made the dog restless. He dried his hands and leaned on the counter. The house felt heavier now, not oppressive, but full, like a lung that had finally inhaled after 70 years of holding its breath. The vault, the journal, the photograph, the truth Louisa had carried alone. Each revelation added weight to the silence. Ranger stirred, ears flicking. Daniel stepped toward him. "What is it, boy?" But before the dog could respond, a noise crackled outside, soft, brittle, like a foot snapping a dry twig. Ranger's head snapped up, his body tensed, muscles coiling beneath his sable coat. He let out a low, controlled growl. Another sound followed, soft shuffling, the unmistakable whisper of movement near the porch steps. Daniel's breath stilled. The floor beneath his feet felt suddenly thin. Ranger stood fully now, tail low, posture angled toward the door, in a stance Daniel recognized from his military K-9 days. Alert, ready, certain. A shadow crossed the porch window. Ranger barked, one sharp, authoritative note. Daniel moved quickly, grabbing the flashlight from the table. His mind spun, not in panic, but in rapid assessment. Someone had been inside the house before. Someone had left that footprint. And someone had watched him earlier in Hartwell. He approached the door quietly, Ranger beside him, the dog's breath short, taut lines of tension running through every inch of his body. Then the glass shattered. A figure burst through the window, lean, fast, wearing dark winter clothes. His movements were quick, violent, trained. Daniel barely had time to duck before the intruder raised a small pistol. Ranger lunged, teeth flashing in the dim light, knocking the man's arm aside at the exact moment he pulled the trigger. The gunshot cracked through the room. Wood splintered behind them. Daniel hit the floor hard, pulse roaring in his ears. Ranger snarled and drove the attacker back toward the wall. The man was wiry, mid-40s, with sharp cheekbones and a poorly shaved jaw, eyes cold with desperation. His breath reeked of fear and sweat. He shoved Ranger back and stumbled toward the door. Daniel grabbed Ranger's collar before the dog could tear into the man, pulling him to safety as the attacker fled out the broken window, disappearing into the winter night. For a long moment, the only sound was Ranger's heavy breathing and Daniel's pounding heart. "It's okay," Daniel whispered shakily, though his hands trembled. "We're all right. We're all right." But he wasn't. The adrenaline lit every nerve inside him like wildfire. His PTSD surged in waves, memories colliding with reality, breath collapsing into rapid, shallow pulls. He sank to his knees, gripping Ranger's fur as though the dog were the only thing keeping him from drowning. Ranger pressed close, resting his weight firmly against Daniel's chest, grounding him with steady pressure. The dog's warmth anchored him. Daniel shut his eyes tight, trying to slow the panic that clawed upward from old wounds buried in sand and smoke. "Daniel! Daniel! Can you hear me?" The voice was distant at first, then closer. Footsteps crunched on the porch. The front door, still intact, swung open, and Emma rushed in, hair windblown, cheeks flushed from the cold. Behind her came two men from town, neighbors, drawn by the sound of the gunshot. Emma dropped to Daniel's side without hesitation, kneeling directly in the broken glass. Her hands, gentle from years of tending to Louisa, touched his shoulders with remarkable steadiness. "It's all right. Look at me," she said softly. "You're safe. Breathe with me, okay? In and out, slowly." Daniel forced his lungs to obey, matching her rhythm. Ranger remained pressed against him, a silent shield. Emma brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, her hazel eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fierce resolve. "I heard the shot from the clinic," she explained. "I ran." One of the men behind her stepped forward, Caleb Whitmer, a tall, broad-shouldered farmer in his early 50s, with graying sideburns and hands scarred from years of field work, surveyed the room with cautious eyes. Caleb had a quiet, sturdy presence, the kind of man shaped by long winters and harder harvests. He picked up a broken shard of window glass and exhaled sharply. "You weren't imagining that footprint earlier," Caleb said. "Someone's been watching you." Beside him stood Freddie Mallon, a wiry young mechanic with copper hair and grease-stained hands. Freddie was barely 30, but worry lines marked his forehead, the result of years raising younger siblings after their parents died. He glanced toward the window frame. "He fired inside the house?" Freddie asked, voice shaking slightly. "Yes," Emma replied, her tone protective as she kept Daniel steady. Ranger stopped it from hitting him. Caleb let out a long, low whistle. "That dog's worth his weight in gold." Daniel finally managed to take a full breath. He looked up at the three of them, neighbors who didn't owe him anything but came anyway. His chest ached with something unfamiliar. Gratitude, belonging, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. Emma squeezed his shoulder gently. "You're shaking," she said softly. "But you're safe now. We've got you." Ranger shifted, laying his head in Daniel's lap as though affirming Emma's words. Caleb moved around the room, inspecting the damage. "We'll get this cleaned up," he said matter-of-factly. "Hartwell looks after its own." Freddie nodded quickly. "I'll board the window tonight, no charge." Daniel stared at them, stunned. "You don't have to do that." Caleb shook his head. "Your aunt helped half this town at one point or another. You think we'd let her nephew deal with this alone?" Emma sat back on her heels, meeting Daniel's eyes. "You're not alone anymore, not here." The words landed in him like gentle weight, warm and unfamiliar. People moved around him, sweeping up glass, securing the broken window. One neighbor bringing a blanket, another placing a steaming bowl of soup on the table. Ranger stayed near Daniel's side as though guarding him from himself, but the worst of the panic had ebbed. Outside, more townspeople gathered, older couples in thick coats, a pair of teenage boys who lived down the road, a retired mailman who had known Louisa for 50 years. Their faces glowed in the porch light, kind and concerned, murmuring soft reassurances through the cold air. Daniel's breath steadied fully for the first time since the attack, his gaze sweeping the room filled with people who had no reason to come except that they cared. These were not soldiers, not comrades forged in battle. They were ordinary men and women, but their presence felt like a shield more profound than armor. He looked at Emma. She gave him a small, warm smile. For the first time in years, something inside him whispered, "You're home." Snow began to fall before midnight, soft at first, drifting flakes that settled on the broken window frame Freddie hadn't yet finished boarding up. Daniel stood in the hallway, watching the storm thicken through the shards of glass still glittering on the floor. Despite the warmth from the wood stove, the air felt cold, too still. Ranger paced back and forth, unable to relax, his ears twitching with every distant sound. Daniel trusted that tension. It was the same instinct that had saved his life more than once. Emma slept lightly on the couch, having refused to leave him alone after the attack. Her auburn hair spread over the cushion, her breathing steady but shallow with worry. Daniel admired her resilience, how she could look so gentle yet carry such unwavering strength. Caleb had left earlier, promising to return at dawn with tools to reinforce the house. Freddie had gone to fetch extra boards. The others from the town had drifted home reluctantly, leaving behind blankets, food, and a sense of community Daniel had never expected to feel. But the night did not settle. Ranger froze suddenly, head snapping toward the back door. His body stiffened, hackles lifting. A low, dangerous growl rippled through his chest. Daniel whispered, "What do you hear?" Before Ranger could respond, a faint sound cut through the wind, a metallic click, distant but unmistakable. The sound of a rifle bolt sliding into place. Daniel's blood chilled. He grabbed Emma's shoulder gently, waking her. She shot upright, eyes wide and alert, instincts quick. "What's wrong?" "They're back," Daniel said quietly. "More of them." Ranger barked once, a sharp alarm. A second sound followed, closer this time, soft footsteps crunching through snow. Then another metallic click, then whispers, multiple voices. Their attackers had returned, and they hadn't come alone. Emma's face paled, but she stood immediately. "We need to move." Daniel nodded. "There's a back path down the slope, but they'll have it covered." Ranger suddenly ran to the pantry, pawing furiously at the floorboards. Daniel blinked. "What is it, boy?" Ranger scraped again, nose pressed against a knot in the wood. Daniel dropped to one knee. Beneath the pantry shelves, hidden behind jars and old supplies, was a wooden trap door he'd never noticed. The hinges were rusted, almost fused with time. He pulled hard. The panel lifted with a groan of protest. A stairway yawned below, steep, narrow, and swallowed by darkness. Emma stared. "What is that?" Daniel remembered Louisa's stories. His breath caught. A tunnel from Prohibition days. The house used to be connected to an old bootlegging route. Ranger whined urgently. No time to hesitate. The first volley of gunfire shattered the back windows. Daniel grabbed Emma's hand. "Go!" Ranger descended first, disappearing into the dark, paws landing silently on the cold earth below. Emma followed, gripping Daniel's hand tightly. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from adrenaline. Daniel shut the trapdoor above them just as a bullet punched through the wall. Darkness swallowed them. The air smelled of soil and thyme, earthy and damp, a scent Daniel hadn't breathed since old military tunnels overseas. His chest tightened, his pulse thudded in his ears. The enclosed space constricted around him. The tunnel walls felt too close, too low, too suffocating. His breath quickened. Not now, not here, not again. Emma turned toward him, her eyes barely visible in the faint beam of Daniel's flashlight. She placed a hand on his chest, steady and warm. "Daniel," she whispered, voice calm as a heartbeat. "You're not back there. You're here. You're with me. And you're not fighting this alone anymore." He clutched her wrist instinctively, grounding himself. Ranger pressed against his legs, offering silent support. The panic loosened its grip slowly, like a fist unclenching. Daniel forced a deep breath. "Okay," he whispered. "I'm okay." Emma nodded. "Then let's keep moving." The tunnel stretched on for what felt like miles, sloping downward beneath the forest. The wooden supports were ancient, some warped with age, but Louisa's notes in the basement made sudden sense. She had inspected these tunnels every year, quietly, thoroughly. Outside, muffled gunshots cracked like distant thunder, then faded as the group of intruders discovered the empty house. After nearly 15 minutes of walking, a faint glow appeared at the end of the tunnel, a crack of light slicing through the darkness. Ranger quickened his pace. They emerged into a small stone chamber with a wooden door on the far side. Snow drifted in through the gaps. Daniel pushed it open. Cold night wind rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. They were in the forest, deep enough that the town's lights were distant glimmers beyond the trees. Snowflakes swirled like silver dust, settling on Ranger's fur. Emma shivered and wrapped her coat tighter. Then Ranger barked softly, tail wagging once before resettling into alert focus. A warm yellow glow flickered ahead, a lantern swinging gently on a porch. A small cabin stood nestled among the pines, built of thick logs and framed in stone. Smoke curled from the chimney. A man stepped out, holding the lantern higher. He was stout, in his late 60s, with a thick gray beard and shoulders that spoke of a life working the land. His wife followed, short, with a kind face, silver hair braided down her back, wrapped in a woolen shawl. The man blinked in shock, then recognition lit his eyes. "Lord Almighty." "Daniel Hartwell," he murmured. Daniel frowned. "Do I know you?" The woman stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't, dear, but we knew Louisa. 30 years ago, she saved our family from freezing in a winter worse than this one. She brought blankets, food, medicine. She stayed with us until the storm passed." The man nodded, eyes soft. "She told us once, 'If my boy ever comes home lost, help him find his way.' We didn't know what she meant, until now." Emma gripped Daniel's arm, her breath catching slightly. The woman opened the door wider. "Come inside. You look frozen and hunted." Daniel hesitated, years of instinct telling him not to burden others, not to bring danger to their doorstep. But the man shook his head firmly. "Son, your aunt saved our lives. Tonight we return the favor." Something in Daniel broke, for the first time in years, not from pain, but from being seen, truly seen. Ranger nudged his thigh gently, sensing the fracture. Daniel stepped inside. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them like a blanket. Firelight danced across the wooden walls. The couple moved quickly, laying out blankets, heating broth, tending to Emma's cold hands, offering Ranger a bowl of warm water. Daniel stood by the fire, trembling, not from cold, but from the overwhelming kindness he had spent so many years living without. Tears rose before he could stop them. He turned away, ashamed, but Emma touched his shoulder softly. "It's all right," she whispered. "You're safe now." The old couple stood nearby, their faces full of gentle understanding. Daniel covered his eyes with one shaking hand. And in that small cabin in the snowy woods, his aunt's words echoing across decades, Daniel Hartwell cried for the first time in years. Not because he was broken, but because, for the first time, he wasn't alone. The snow in Hartwell had barely melted when Daniel found himself boarding a government transport plane bound for Washington, D.C. The cold mountain air was replaced by the sterile hum of aviation metal, the faint buzz of overhead lights, and a sense of gravity that seemed to thicken the farther he traveled from home. Ranger sat at his feet, calm and regal despite the unfamiliar environment, ears perked and brown-black coat gleaming under the cabin lights. Emma sat beside Daniel, her posture straight but her hand resting lightly over his, grounding him in the strange weight of what lay ahead. Washington felt like another world. Glass buildings mirrored a steel-gray sky. Streets buzzed with urgency. Traffic pulsed like arteries carrying the heartbeat of the nation. For a man who had spent years hiding from noise and crowds, it was nearly overwhelming. But Daniel had come with purpose. Louisa's truth could no longer remain buried in a basement vault. They were met at Treasury headquarters by Deputy Secretary Martin Hale, a stern man in his early 60s with a tall, angular frame and hair cut with military precision. His silver hair contrasted sharply with the deep tan of someone who golfed more than he slept. His blue eyes were calculating, but not unkind. Rather, they carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent his life inside bureaucracy. His handshake was firm. "Mr. Hartwell," Hale said, voice clipped but respectful. "We reviewed the preliminary documents your attorney sent. If what you claim is accurate—" He paused, as if wrestling with the weight of 70 years of administrative negligence. "Then this is one of the largest unreturned wartime caches in U.S. history." Daniel nodded. "It's accurate." Hale studied him for a moment, then looked at Ranger with curiosity. "This your dog?" Daniel rested a hand on Ranger's head. "He saved my life." Hale's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but the closest he had offered yet. "Then, let's hope he gets some recognition, too." Inside the Treasury Archives room, analysts and archivists gathered around the pallets of crates Daniel had surrendered. They wore ID badges, gloves, and expressions ranging from awe to disbelief. One by one, the crates were opened under strict protocol. Gold bars gleamed beneath the harsh white lights, neatly stacked, untouched, sealed with stamps from an era nearly forgotten. 240 crates, $16 billion in unclaimed wartime assets. Emma gasped softly beside Daniel, covering her mouth with both hands. Ranger sat tall, tail still, watching everything as though protecting not just Daniel, but the legacy unfolding before them. A reporter from the Washington Post, a woman named Lydia Graves, arrived shortly after with a notepad in hand. She was in her 40s, sharp-featured with short jet-black hair tucked behind her ears and eyes that missed nothing. Her tone was calm but firm. She had the confidence of someone who had spent 2 decades chasing truths that didn't want to be found. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, extending her hand, "I understand you've uncovered something extraordinary. I'd like to ensure your aunt's story is told accurately." Daniel hesitated. Cameras unsettled him. Crowds unsettled him. But Louisa had lived her whole life in quiet sacrifice. If her name was finally to be cleared, he needed to speak. "All right," he said quietly. They stepped into a briefing room crowded with journalists, photographers, and flashing cameras. The intensity of the lights hit Daniel like shrapnel. His breath stuttered. His fingers trembled. Emma immediately took his hand, squeezing gently. "I'm here," she whispered. Ranger pressed against his leg, warm and steady. Daniel lifted his head. Lydia Graves asked the first question. "Mr. Hartwell, can you confirm how long these assets remained hidden in Hartwell, and why your aunt did not report them?" Daniel stepped toward the podium. Microphones crackled. The room fell silent. "My aunt, Louisa Hartwell," he began, voice steadying with each word, did not hide gold. She kept a promise. He took the photograph from his breast pocket, the same one from the vault. He held it up for the cameras. This is Louisa and her husband, Captain Thomas Hartwell. He died in the war. Before he left, he asked her to safeguard a shipment intended for federal recovery. She signed a confidentiality oath. The officer in charge passed away soon after, and the retrieval process was lost in the bureaucratic fog of wartime. Journalists murmured, flashbulbs burst. Ranger growled softly but didn't move. Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. She didn't report it because she was afraid the government would think she stole it. She didn't tell me because she didn't want me caught in legal crossfire. She carried that burden for 70 years, alone. He paused, throat tight. She kept a vow because the man she loved died asking her to. Emma wiped a tear from her cheek. Daniel set the photo down carefully. So no, she didn't hoard gold. She honored the last words of a soldier who never made it home. The room fell into reverent quiet. Hale stepped forward. The Treasury fully exonerates Louisa Hartwell. She is, from this day forward, officially commended for her integrity and service. Applause erupted, soft at first, then swelling. Daniel felt emotion rise in his chest. Grief, relief, pride tangled together. Then something unexpected happened. A uniformed representative from the National Canine Service Corps approached the podium. He was a broad man in his 50s, with a thick mustache and warm brown eyes. His uniform bore ribbons and service pins, and his posture radiated the calm authority of someone who had trained dogs for decades. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, voice booming with ceremony, "your companion ranger displayed exceptional courage during the attack in Hartwell and again during your evacuation. On behalf of our committee, we award him the title of K9 Civilian Guardian." Daniel blinked. The representative clipped a small silver medallion to Ranger's collar. The dog straightened proudly as though he understood the significance entirely. Cameras flashed wildly. Reporters clapped. Emma laughed through tears. Daniel knelt beside Ranger, pressing his forehead to the dog's. "Good boy," he whispered. "You've always been a guardian." When he stood again, he felt something shift inside him, like a weight finally lifting. The truth was out. Louisa was free. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. Spring returned to Hartwell in slow breaths. Snowbanks shrinking into the thawing earth, the river loosening under the afternoon sun, and the old stone house glowing golden again, as if awakened after decades of carrying secrets. Daniel stood on the porch, watching workers unload construction materials from a flatbed truck. Ranger sat beside him, head high, tail sweeping the floorboards with a steady, content rhythm. Emma approached from the driveway carrying a clipboard, sunlight catching the loose strands of auburn hair that fell from her braid. She had an energy he had never seen before. Purpose, hope, a quiet strength rising into something brighter. The weeks following the Washington announcement had been a whirlwind. Treasury investigators arrived, lawyers drafted statements, and the nation learned the story of a woman who had kept a vow longer than most governments kept a memory. Daniel had been interviewed on television, though he could hardly recall what he said. His palms had sweated through the entire broadcast, and Emma had squeezed his hand out of frame to keep him grounded. Ranger had sat proudly at his feet, wearing the silver medallion from his K9 Civilian Guardian Award. Legally, Daniel was entitled to none of the gold. Every bar belonged to the U.S. Treasury. But Congress approved a lawful compensation package for his role in recovering a federal asset, a sizable financial reward, along with lifetime veteran medical support. It was more than enough for Daniel to change his life. But he didn't change his life for himself. He changed it for others. Emma joined him on the porch, glancing over his shoulder at the spread of construction. "They poured the foundation today," she said, voice warm with quiet pride. "The clinic will be standing before autumn." Daniel nodded, his gaze softening. Louisa would have liked that, turning something hidden into something that helps. Emma smiled gently. "She's the reason we're even here." They walked down toward the clearing near the old oak tree, where a signpost had been planted. White canvas covered the lettering until the grand opening ceremony, but Daniel knew every word by heart. He had read them aloud 100 times while standing alone in the field. Heartwell Healing Foundation. For veterans, for families, for hope. A group of local volunteers worked nearby, hammering beams, laying gravel, guiding posts into the earth. They waved at Daniel, and he waved back. The townspeople had embraced the project with surprising eagerness. After all, Louisa Hartwell had been their protector long before Daniel arrived. Now they were returning that love through labor and generous donations. The foundation would fund counseling programs, therapy sessions, and job placement for veterans who needed a place to breathe again. Attached to it, on the southern side of the property, would stand the Heartwell Community Clinic, with Emma as its first manager. Emma had always taken care of others. Now she would have a place built for that calling. Across the field, a separate crew worked with a set of trainers from a nearby K-9 facility. 2 women and 1 man in gray uniforms, all in their 30s. One of them, Tara O'Neill, stood out. She had a tough, wiry frame, short, sandy blonde hair, and a sunburned complexion from years outdoors. Her eyes were sharp blue, yet kind. Tara had served in the Army as a dog handler and had a way of communicating with Ranger that Daniel found impressive. She spoke softly, using hand gestures more than words. Ranger watched her attentively, then followed her instructions perfectly. "She's good with him," Emma said quietly. "She's good with all dogs," Daniel replied. "The PTSD therapy center wouldn't be the same without her." It had been Daniel's idea to build a K-9 therapy training facility using Ranger as the program's symbol. Veterans would learn to handle, train, and bond with dogs who could pull them out of darkness just as Ranger had done for him. "And what about the learning house?" Emma asked, smiling as 2 teenagers carried bricks toward the far lot. "That one was yours," Daniel reminded her gently. The Heartwell Learning House, a school for low-income children in the county, was her dream. Emma wanted to give children what Louisa had given her, a safe place, a warm voice, a figure of hope during the years she lost her mother. Daniel admired that vision more than he could say. Later that afternoon, Daniel and Emma returned to the stone house to prepare for the dedication ceremony. Volunteers had arranged folding chairs in the yard, and floral arrangements, lilies and wildflowers, decorated the porch. Families gathered, some wearing Sunday clothes, some wearing denim and flannel shirts, but all carrying warmth in their eyes. Among them were the Adlers, standing hand in hand at the front row, faces glowing with pride. Caleb Whitmer, the farmer with quiet strength, leaned against a fence post, his gray sideburns ruffled by wind. Freddie Mallon arrived late, wiping grease off his hands, still wearing his mechanic's overalls. Daniel felt overwhelmed, but in a strangely peaceful way. When the sun began to set, painting the sky amber and rose, Emma stood beside Daniel at the podium. Ranger lay between them, chin resting on his paws, medallion catching the light with each breath. A hush fell over the crowd. Daniel opened the cream-colored envelope he had kept close to his heart. The final letter from Louisa, found tucked inside her journal. His voice wavered at first, but strengthened with each word. Noi buon vi kai chet qua ta se dan con ve nha. From here on, the rest of your life will lead others out of the dark. Daniel lowered the letter, tears glistening but no longer heavy. Emma reached for his hand and held it openly, without hesitation. Her touch was warm, steady, sure. Ranger lifted his head, nudging, their hands together before settling back down, content, almost proud. The crowd stood and applauded, gentle at first, then rising into a swell that echoed through the pines and the old stone house behind them. Daniel breathed it in, not as a soldier, not as a man haunted by war, but as someone finally allowed to live. Louisa's legacy was no longer buried in a basement vault. It lived in the clinic walls, the foundation pillars, the barking of therapy dogs, the laughter of children who would walk through the learning house doors, and in the hearts of the people who had chosen to stand beside him. The legacy lived in Emma, her compassion, her quiet bravery, her unwavering belief that Daniel was worth saving, and it lived in Ranger, steadfast guardian, loyal companion, the bridge that connected two damaged souls and guided them both toward healing. For the first time in decades, Daniel felt whole, and as the sky dimmed and the lanterns flickered on, he whispered, "Thank you, Aunt Louisa. You brought me home." In the end, Daniel's journey reminded Hartwell, and all of us, that healing rarely arrives as thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly, through a neighbor's kindness, a loyal dog's steady presence, or a love brave enough to wait in the dark until light returns. Louisa's vow, Ranger's courage, and Emma's compassion showed that miracles are not distant. God plants them in ordinary days, carried by ordinary people. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope tonight. Leave a prayer in the comments, subscribe for more uplifting stories, and may God's grace gently guide you through every season of your life.